up, Poppy friends? I've been deep diving into Marvel Crisis Protocol for the past month and a half, 2 months now, and I thought now would be a great time to really just show off some high-res turnarounds of what I've painted so far for the game, and then just talk briefly about why I got into this game, what I'm really enjoying about it, why I chose the roster that I'm currently playing, and then what my future plans are for the coming months and probably for the rest of the year. So why I got into this game. I didn't think that I would. When the game was first released, I think sometime last year, Chris, one of the co-owners at the hobby store I go to, Lords of War, he was really pushing it and trying to get me into it because he thought that it would be a game that, one, that I would enjoy. He was right. But two, also, I guess he was also trying to build up the community and get more of us into the game. I'm not particularly an avid comic reader, and outside of the MCU, I don't really know much about superheroes and villains. And so my initial thought or impression of the game was it wasn't really for me. I didn't think that I would enjoy painting the models as much as I do, and I didn't think I'd enjoy the game as much as I did. However, I'm a huge fan of the small skirmish style games, and something that this game affords is it's a low model count, and the models are actually scaled to a very comfortable 40 millimeters. So they're quite a touch bigger than Games Workshop's models without being overly big, like something like the 75 millimeter figures or a larger scale bust that you might paint for display or one-offs. So working on these models, it's a nice balance between small tabletop pieces that you can turn out, but still being big enough to have a lot of detail to capture. And then because they are being based on comic art, or in some cases the MCU uniforms and outfits, they're not covered in the traditional detail like Games Workshop likes to stick on their models. They're not really covered in like gems and skulls and all these fiddly things that make them a pain to paint. And then because no two models are alike, every single hero is unique or individual, you're not really grinding through when you're building up a roster. Once you've painted up a hero, you're probably not painting anything like that ever again, with the exception of some of the affiliations or where heroes are paired together. Their uniforms might bear some similarity in terms of colors or design. So for example, painting Iron Man and War Machine, painting two suits of iron armor. When you're painting Captain America and the new Captain Falcon, for example, you're going to have some of those similar stars and stripes. They're both military uniforms, so they're going to have similar details. But for the most part, all the heroes are unique and they're a lot of fun to paint. When I started playing the game as well, the core mechanics actually reminded me a lot of Guild Ball, where the actual mechanics to play the game itself are very simple and very straightforward. It's a very tight, very neat written rule set without a lot of wiggle room for breaking. They're very clear in the way that they've written the rules. They're very concise, and it's all just about following the sequence. And then because everything is built off of this core sequence and this core set of rules, you can then bring in complexity with all the different characters introducing, the way that players are building their rosters, and then which affiliations they choose to play. And I think that's also something I'm really enjoying much more than Guild Ball. One of the biggest issues I had with Guild Ball was that because you only really had, I think there was 8 or 9 teams by the time I stopped playing the game, and because each of those teams only had a fixed set of up to 12 players, depending on whether they were one of the older rosters or some of the newer ones which only had their core 6. Invariably, you always had the most competitive 6 for a particular team, and you would only ever see those 6 with maybe a variation of 1 or 2 depending on the roster and the play style. So for example, I played Fisherman, and they really only had 2 builds based on which captain you chose. If you wanted something that was all football-y and board control, like movement style, you played Shark, and that dictated your other 5 players. Whereas if you played Corsair, which is a little bit more of a brawly team, or at least brawly for Fishermen, but still more about controlling the board and controlling or dictating where you're going to be playing the scrums, how you're getting the ball out and scoring your goals, you also had a fixed roster. And it got boring because after a while, the game was a known quantity. Steam Forged wasn't releasing enough teams and enough models. And at a certain point, when you played against a team, you knew exactly what they were going to bring because there was, in essence, one or two good ways to play that team, and all the other characters didn't really matter. With Marvel, because you can basically mix and match and choose whichever hero you want or whichever villain you want to build whatever roster you can imagine, there's actually a lot of not just freedom for a person to build a roster that suits their style and the way they want to play the game, but there's also, I don't want to say an infinite, but there are a lot of possible combinations for the roster you bring and how it matches up against a roster that someone else might bring, which really brings in a lot of depth because the different characters will interact differently and certain characters are stronger or weaker against others. And one of the things I like is you build a 10-man roster that you're going to bring to a game, and then based on the scenario or the crises and the threat value, which is your points value they're going to be playing, you then pick your team members from that roster based on the scenario and who your opponent is and what you think they're going to bring. And so I think beyond actually playing the game on the table, a lot of the strategy and a lot of what I'm really enjoying about Marvel is that right down to the roster building, the crises you choose to build your deck, and then your tactics cards and the way that you pick your roster based on the scenario and your opponent. I think that's really where the strategy of the game lies. And it's not just about being able to play your team, but being able to think through why you're picking the heroes you're picking, the scenario that you want to be playing based on your opponent. There's a lot of variability there that I think is going to create a lot of depth and longevity in the future, especially because with comics and with Marvel especially, there's a whole depth of heroes and villains to choose from, and as long as they release one or two heroes and villains every month, I think it'll completely change the way everyone builds their rosters. And really the only limitation is the affiliation that you're going to be choosing to play. I think right now there's maybe about a dozen affiliations, so things like Avengers, X-Force, Cabal, Syndicate, Web Warriors, Wakanda, Asgard. Those will dictate sort of the theme of your roster. And so, for example, I'm building Web Warriors, so I'm going to be bringing a lot of the different Spider-Mans. I have Venom, Carnage, Ghost Spider, and the affiliation you choose will in turn dictate how many of those particular heroes you're going to field in your roster. But that doesn't mean that your roster has to be only those models. Really, as long as when you pick your team, half of your team comes from a certain affiliation, everyone else can be whoever you want. And so there's a lot of creativity there for people who want to tell a narrative, build a story, or on the opposite spectrum, for people who really want to play this game at a tournament level where they're looking to eke out every bit of power from the game. You can then pick and choose the heroes and the affiliations to build the strongest roster you can for the way that you want to play the game. So I think unlike Guild Ball, there is a future for this game that will be heavily dictated by the community and not the game creator. So the roster that I'm playing is Web Warriors. Basically, that's Spider-Man and friends. And one of the, well, I guess two of the big reasons I chose Web Warriors. One, I'm a huge fan of Into the Spider-Verse. It's probably my favorite Marvel movie to date and one of my favorite animated films. And I also grew up with Spider-Man. I watched a lot of that cartoon and nothing else, not even X-Men. It's probably the hero that I don't want to say I most identify with, but it's the most iconic hero to me, and it's always been the first hero I think of when I think of comics and superheroes. I also want to pick I wanted to start with a faction and an affiliation where I would enjoy painting all of the models. Because I'm approaching this from a narrative perspective and I'm looking to play this game for fun and it's all about the storytelling for me, I wanted to make sure that I would have a team I would enjoy collecting every single model for, that I would enjoy painting the most. And I think Web Warriors fit that bill to a T. The Miles Morales model in particular, especially after I converted him into his urban outfit in the film, and then models like Venom, Ghost Spider, Amazing Spider-Man, Daredevil, Carnage, everything they've released for the Web Warriors, I've really enjoyed, and I've thoroughly enjoyed painting. And I think that's also why my starting roster includes all those models, with a bit of Wakanda, which I'll get into in a bit. I'm really enjoying. I really enjoyed working on this team, and it also helped that as I played a couple of games and sort of learned the core rules and the way that Web Warriors want to play, they're all about board control and objective control. Very high paced, very fast team. They can move across the board really quickly, and they're less about brawling and fighting. So they're not necessarily going to want to run up and just hit their opponents in the face, although some of the heroes can and want to. For the most part, they want to be playing keep away. They want to grab the objectives and then deny their opponent from being able to play the objective game. And surprise, surprise, that's pretty much how I played Guild Ball as well. I played a lot of Fishermen. I think they were my main team for 2 years. I played Morticians for a year. And then even when I played a team like the Butchers, I played them more as a scoring team. I brought a lot of scores, like I think it was Shank, and I loved running Fillet as a captain. And there's another female character who I forget the name of, but she was one of their best goal scorers. Not Angel. Either way, I played the Butchers much like a scoring team with a bit of brawl. And I think that's really what I'm enjoying about the Web Warriors. And they're not just necessarily going to want to hit you, but there are times I recognize where you're going to want to have to be able to brawl, especially if your opponent picks crises that force you to hold certain parts of the board or to come into them. And so to diversify and to round out my roster, I've brought in Wakanda. So on paper, I think the Black Panther is one of the best and most durable brawlers in the game, especially paired with the leadership ability of Miles Morales. And Shuri really plays into the ability of the Web Warriors to control, especially at long range. She has the longest range push in the game, really consistent way to generate power. And then Okoye as a low threat bodyguard will be able to help me fill out some of those awkward threat points where I either want to bring more models of my opponents to out-activate, or if I want to bring a heavy hitter like Amazing Spider-Man, I can fit in a low point model like Okoye. So I'm not losing out on models because I'm bringing some of my heavy hitters. It also helps that, in a similar vein to the Web Warriors, I really love all of the Wakanda models. I also have to paint up Killmonger, although I don't think he'll make it roster. And then at some point, I'll probably pick up Storm just to be able to say that I have the entire Wakanda affiliation as well. I had considered a couple of other brawling affiliations or models. Asgard really came to mind. I think that's probably the second most popular one. I think on paper, Asgard probably also brings more flexibility to the way Web Warriors wants to play. But my issue with Asgard is that they're all threat 4s. They're really expensive, and it makes them hard to fit in when I'm picking and choosing models to round out a team for a given scenario. Wakanda doesn't have that problem where I think Black Panther's a 4, but then Shuri's a 3 and Okoye is a 2. So they're fairly low cost models that I can fit into rosters fairly easily. And I think keying into, and this is part of my next steps as well, there are a few models in my roster that I do want to swap out because they either do the same thing that other models do, but they're not worse at it, but they're less flexible. And they're also too high of a points cost. So insofar as next steps, at least for the next couple of months, I want to get in more games with my Web Warriors. I want to first be able to learn my own affiliation more, to at least get to the point where I can play the heroes without looking at their cards every single turn, and then get a stronger sense of what other affiliations do, what other teams can do, to then figure out how do I want to expand my Web Warriors? I'm probably going to keep building on or around a core of Miles, Ghost Spider, and Shuri. At least for the foreseeable future, I don't really connect with most of the villains, except for maybe Spider Foes. So I think I'm going to keep expanding on my current roster. If you've been following my socials, I've also been building up a modular subway board. And this is heavily inspired by Rob Hawkins' Gen Con display. He made this really, really cool New York subway board, and that really heavily inspired me to build my own. I love the look of Marvel boards and what other people have been doing with different parkettes. They've been doing urban streets and things like that. And I think down the road, I'll also build those as well. But we already have a few of those kinds of boards at our local hobby store. And I wanted to make something a little different to allow us to be able to vary up our play and to be able to tell a story. This is also my first foray into building a modular board. And I think a subway is probably an easier way to do it. Because you're only going to really need a couple of sections to build either the platforms or the tracks. And then this will also give me the opportunity to build some really cool looking sections that I can then use as photography backdrops for my models. So I'm hoping to get that done within the next month and a half. And then hopefully even start recording some battle reports. Something that I've been wanting to do for a while, and I don't want to do it for 40K or Age of Sigmar just because those games they do take so long. But Marvel being more skirmish, smaller scale, and then there aren't as many content creators for particularly Marvel versus Protocol, both just in terms of entertaining for gameplay and for teaching tactics. So I think this will be a really good opportunity for me to start playing around with and experimenting on how I'm going to approach creating that kind of content. I'm also going to be tweaking my roster a little bit. Just looking at it on paper, there are a couple of heroes that I think do the exact same thing. Essentially, they're redundant both in terms of how they want to play the game and then being too high threat where I'm not really taking them in my roster. So the heroes I'm thinking of are Amazing Spider-Man, Venom, Daredevil, Carnage, and Black Panther. So I have these 5 models to essentially give my team a bit of brawling ability and durability to actually sit on a point on the board and just hold it. But I think because they're all threat 4 except for Spider-Man, who's threat 5, very expensive, very hard to fit in multiples of them. And realistically, if I'm only ever bringing 1 or 2 of them in a game, it's always going to be Black Panther and Amazing Spider-Man. Venom has some possibilities. I really love the model, and his toolkit does have a bit of board control. He has a pseudo webline pull, where he can pull enemy models closer towards him and potentially off objectives. So I think I'll keep him in the roster for times where I want a brawler, but still also want to play that control game, where I might take Spider-Man and Venom instead of Black Panther. So what that means is I'm probably going to be dropping Carnage and Daredevil. They're both brawlers. Carnage, high damage, but very low on the defenses against Energy and Mystic. So he's got a lot of bad matchups. And then Daredevil, I just don't think he does a whole lot except for tank, which both Black Panther and Spider-Man can do as well. So honestly, I'm probably just going to drop those 2 and then bring in a couple of low threat models that fit the theme. So I've picked up Black Widow and Hawkeye, who are, I'll be using Hawkeye as his threat 3 from his expansion box, and then I'm actually going to use the core set rules for Black Widow because she's a threat 2. And what this will allow me to do is at 19 or 20 threats, some of the larger games, if I really, really want or need to bring 7 heroes onto the board, I can bring both Okoye and Black Widow, and potentially bring a 7-wide team. Because the way I want to play Web Warriors, I want to actually give a priority and activate last every single round. Having more models means that I can basically guarantee that, have more objective grabbers, and I think more activations is for the most part, better. So I think she fits in very well. Widow also fits the spider theme. And then I think for the narrative, because Black Widow and Hawkeye have so much history, I think pairing the two of them together is a no-brainer. And Hawkeye gives me good options for long-range shooting, and also some mixed damage profile, being able to do both physical and energy damage. I also pretty much already have all of the spider foes. All I'm missing is Green Goblin, Kingpin, and Dr. Octopus. So I think whenever Lords of War gets in Green Goblin, I'll probably pick him up, I'll grab Kingpin, and then I'll have to figure out a way to convert up Dr. Octavia into the Spider-Verse, and that'll actually give me the Spider Foes affiliation as well. So if I want to play them, I'll have the option. That's it for this video. I don't want to talk or ramble too much. I'll try, and hopefully I've cut this down. I think in recording it ended up being like a half hour, so I'll try and cut it down to half that. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you enjoyed looking at the models, and let me know in the comments below if there's any specific content that you do want to see. I have been creating a lot of painting tutorials for Patreon, but I don't mind creating some for YouTube as well. Because the models are simpler, I can do some really, really cool color scheme callouts or how to paint on tiny little sections. So if you want to see something specific, maybe even tactics videos or how to play videos, drop a comment below, let me know, and I'll see what I can do. You can also check out my socials. I'll drop a link in the description below. That's it for me. Until next time, happy hobbying.